Okay, Cyrus, I think we can probably begin now.
Fantastic. All right. Thanks everybody for joining us. So this is an opportunity for EGAP members to get a first preview of results from the Medicata on natural resource governance. We've been doing these internal network events for all three of the Medicatas that have just concluded, so that you get the opportunity to see the results of this very intense and ambitious research initiative, and then also looking forward to your feedback and questions, because this project and the others as well are very much still in the process of developing the papers that will then be going out to the public. And so, there's still the opportunity for revision. With this Medicata, actually, we're in a very nice position because PNAS accepted to entertain a special issue that pending, the review process could feature both the meta-analytical article, which is the focus of Tara's talk today, as well as the individual study papers. And, I would say that that's sort of like the perfect outlet for a Medicata. And so that worked out really well. That said, it's all subject to their review process, so nothing is guaranteed. And so the more we can do to strengthen the contribution and make the findings compelling, the better chance we'll have of actually making good on that. So we've got, Jacqueline, correct me if I'm wrong, we've got an hour and a half set for this, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and so that gives us plenty of time, if, we get to a point where we've gone through the presentation, and I know Zoom fatigue sometimes starts to set in after about an hour. I guess what we can think of is, Tara, you've got 30, 40 minutes or so that you can use for the presentation, and then we can open up to do some Q&A. And so, the latest we can run is till 12:30, but, depending on the energy level, if we end a little bit earlier, that's okay as well. So we've got Tara, who is now my colleague, just a few doors down here at NYU. Delighted to have her here to present the results from the Natural Resources Governance Medicata. So Tara, I turn it over to you.
Sorry. Thank you guys all for joining today. I'm looking forward to presenting this. I'm also grateful to a number of other people on the call. Daniel Rubinson, I think, is here, was also on the steering committee with me, so through this project. So what we have is we want to talk about sort of the findings of our meta-analysis of community monitoring in 6 different sites. Sorry, I have a clicker, but it's not working. Let me see. Great. So today I want to think about how communities manage their common pool resources. And I'm going to use a very standard definition of common pool resources, meaning sort of a natural or man-made resource system with characteristics that may get costly or hard, but not impossible to exclude potential beneficiaries from overusing or over-extracting from the resource. We're going to be focused on natural systems in this project and talk. So we know that the sustainable management of CPRs is really critical to the livelihoods, health, and crisis prevention of the population sort of on the front lines or communities that have these resources. But it's also critically important to combating climate change and preserving biodiversity globally. Thank you that you'll be able to see some of those potential much wider scale impacts when we talk about the specific sites. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change prescribes quite an active role for local communities in terms of managing resources. And sort of to that end, a long literature, including Ostrom and many, many others, come to this consensus that institutions or design features of how communities sort of manage these resources really matter for outcomes. Yet there's less consensus about how do we get there, particularly in communities in which these institutions that are sort of described in the literature have not already been adopted. And so I think that there's sort of two large sort of families of challenges when we think about how do we create or promote more sustainable governance of natural resources at the community level. And so the first is that sort of decades of observing how communities govern common pool resources sort of leads to two sort of observations. The first is that there's tremendous heterogeneity in sort of the design of institutions and practices that communities use to govern and monitor, enforce, et cetera, behavior with respect to CPRs, right? So we see communities doing very, very different things across the globe. And sort of in light of this complexity or heterogeneity, there's sort of a general skepticism running through this literature of panaceas, or the idea that sort of we can find a one-size-fits-all policy. And that makes it really difficult to think about what policies would we even recommend for communities to adopt, and sort of how could they get there, and how can we get communities there. I think this is compounded by two sort of critical research design concerns. And the first is that of sort of endogenous institutional adoption. So when we think about community monitoring, the vast majority of the places where we study community monitoring and observe it and document it are communities that have sort of endogenously or on their own adopted these institutions. And this may work really well in terms of sort of promoting sort of sustainable use of the CPR, but we don't know two things. First, is it possible to get communities that haven't already adopted these to actually adopt these institutions or practices, if you will? And second, if we are able to exogenously encourage communities to do this, would these institutions have the same effects or any effect at all? So I think that we are trying to think about sort of the latter part of this question, right? So in places that haven't already adopted, be talking about monitoring, can monitoring have sort of beneficial effects in this type of adoption? And the second is sort of speaks to the complexity or heterogeneity of how communities govern these resources. And so the sort of design features or governance institutions identified by the literature tend to cluster in communities. So communities will have various sort of properties, both with respect to the natural resource system itself, with respect to users and the ways that users govern the institution. These things cluster, and that makes it really hard to isolate the outcomes of any given institution or practice. So we want to have a research design that sort of tries to address these two concerns to create some policy relevant learning. So what this project is, many of you are familiar with the Maniquetas, and it has a very similar structure. We have a single treatment. We're going to try to create community monitoring regimes in communities that face common pool resource management challenges. We are going to do this in 6 different sites. The breadth or heterogeneity of the sites in this project is evident when we consider that we're looking at 3 distinct resource systems, right, in different communities. So we have 3 sites studying forests, 2 sites studying groundwater, and 1 site studying surface water. And these are all places where monitoring was previously either non-existent or highly irregular. So we're going to ask 2 main questions here. First, just sort of, can community monitoring be facilitated from the outside, i.e. in this case by NGOs? And we find that generally, yes. In 5 of the 6 sites, we have very high rates of uptake and persistence of monitoring activity over the course of a year. Second, we're going to ask, does externally facilitated monitoring affect resource governance and use? And we're also going to find across sites, yes, we see modest reductions in resource use and also modest increases in user or citizen knowledge and satisfaction with the resource. Okay, so for this talk, I want to talk to you about this intervention, and then I'm going to talk about our experimental design across sites. I'll highlight our main results and then talk about some of the policy implications. So our intervention is community monitoring. And so what is monitoring doing here? And so one sort of theme in literature on the management of common pool resources is that sort of various information problems, uncertainty and asymmetries in information lead to non-optimal use or over-extraction of common pool resources. This can be because it's very difficult to enforce in the absence of information. It can be because users don't believe that their behavior is visible to others. So community monitoring is going to fundamentally, or the way that we've conceived of it, is going to generate new information and disseminate this information both to the community and possibly to the resource management authorities, where those two things are not overlapping. We think that this can bring user behavior into compliance with rules by sort of facilitating enforcement or also facilitating the adoption of new rules governing the use of these resources. One problem is that community monitoring, we know, is very costly to adopt, and also it's very costly to maintain. So in light of these challenges and sort of the non-adoption in a lot of communities, one thing sort of in the last 20 years or so, a lot of technological innovation has happened outside of communities that sort of has promises for facilitating both more efficient and accurate monitoring by people on the ground, right? We could think about sort of remote sensing of forest loss happening outside of communities and sort of thinking about how that can facilitate more efficient monitoring by communities themselves, right? And so what our goal here is to try to address both the sort of the former in this point is to sort of facilitate the creation of monitoring programs in communities by equipping them with some new monitoring technologies that may make sort of this giant task of monitoring somewhat simpler. I have a lot of sun coming in right now. I'm really sorry to distract. Okay, hopefully this is better for all of us. All right, so I think it's important to think in terms of thinking what our population is and sort of sites is why thinking about why we chose monitoring as the intervention. So for those of you familiar with the Metacata process, sort of we came to monitoring via a cluster of interest across a lot of regions, resource systems, resource threats, based on an open-ended expression of interest on natural resource governance broadly. And we argue that this is sort of reflective of researcher beliefs that, you know, information problems that hinder sort of sustainable common pool resource management are widespread in a lot of contexts, and that monitoring may be an intervention that's applicable in a large or sort of diverse range of contexts. So I want to sort of take you through our sites really quickly and think about what the monitoring is doing in these places. So our first site, this is China, and this is a picture of the resource system itself, some rivers or surface water. And so in this project, Mark Buntain and Bing Zhang were studying surface water in monitoring of surface water by sort of members of micro neighborhoods alongside rivers in a province in China. And the main threat here is pollution, both by individuals and industrial pollution. I'll go through talk about the two groundwater sites. So these were both sites in semi-arid or semi-arid regions of Latin America. The first is in Brazil. Here you see two monitors using a well water measurement device that was designed as part of this program to try to measure water levels in the well. This was research was done by Alicia Cooperman, Sasha McClarty, and Ricky Syme, and they're studying sort of the monitoring of groundwater in rural villages in Ceará, in Brazil, in the northeast. And these groundwater systems face both natural and sort of man-made threats of overuse and drought. Quite similarly, here in Costa Rica, we have a picture of monitors sort of during the training, sort of allocating responsibility across different wells in the area. And this project was done by Francisco Alpizar, Maria Bernardo del Carpio, and Paul Ferraro. And very similar to Brazil, they were looking at groundwater managed or within the context of villages in Costa Rica that face overuse of groundwater. I'll now talk about the 3 forest studies. Here we have some monitors on a patrol in Liberia. And so this project was done by Darren Christensen, Alex Hartman, and Cyrus Sammy, looking at monitoring of forests by villages who face a threat of overcutting their forests. Okay. Here we have one of the outputs of the monitoring from Peru. So monitors were tasked with sort of finding and documenting deforestation within communities in 2 river basins in the Amazon. I did this project with Jacob Kopis and Johannes Ervelainen. And so we're talking about the forests in the Amazon context. We were working with indigenous communities residing in the area. And here the threat is a little bit different. The primary threat is sort of extraction by outsiders, whether to grow coca, to set up sort of agricultural settlements, or to extract timber. Finally, in Uganda, here we have one of the monitoring training sessions in progress. The Uganda site looks a lot more sort of like Liberia, I would say. And this was done by Sabrina Eisenbar, Louis Graham, and Anouk Rickdrink. They were looking at sort of forest management by villages that face overcutting as a threat. So our harmonized monitoring consisted of sort of 5 aspects. So this is a bundled treatment, and we tried to make the bundle as consistent as possible across contexts. And so our sort of work in the community started with sort of broad community workshops with sort of broad participation to sort of provide information about threats to the resource and sort of what monitoring might do, and then introduce the program. From there, we had monitoring selection, training, and then provided monitors with incentives to do the monitoring over the course of a year. What monitors uncovered during this monitoring then was disseminated to citizens, and then also disseminated to resource management bodies. Of course, in some settings, these are going to be overlapping, right? The community manages the resource, and others, there's sort of a governmental or elected entity managing it. So I would say that the sort of two pieces of this that were not entirely harmonized is that there were not community workshops in China, and in the dissemination of information to resource management bodies occurred in all sites except Brazil, except it was sort of in an alternative treatment arm in China. And we're going to leverage the sort of difference between dissemination to citizens versus management bodies. All right. In terms of our research design, these were 6 coordinated field experiments. And so our unit of assignment is going to be the community. So you could think about sort of the village or the rural community, the indigenous community, the micro neighborhood. And what we have here is we have the list of sites, and then we have the number of communities that were assigned to monitoring, any monitoring, the number that were assigned not to monitoring. So the designs vary a little bit across the sites. So in principle, EGAP encourages sort of an alternative treatment arm. In 2 of our sites, this was sort of not possible due to cost reasons and questions of statistical power. We had 2 sites, Brazil and Uganda, that did a 3-arm design in which the 3rd arm was additive above the monitoring, and sort of a light touch intervention above that. And then we had 2 sort of factorial experiments in China where there was dissemination to government on the alternative treatment arm, and in Liberia where there was sort of a separate negotiation training treatment. So what we're ultimately going to be estimating and comparing today is sort of just thinking about comparing along these margins in terms of the community assigned to monitoring versus not. We're going to be looking at sort of meta estimates, so to speak, of the intent to treat effect. You will notice here that sort of our sites had somewhere between 76 and 160, I guess 161 communities. And you may think, these are somewhat underpowered. Well, I don't think that the number of communities is sort of that far off what a lot of community level treatments are in social science. We agree that sort of the design in each study may not be sufficient to pick up sort of modest treatment effects. The way that we've conceptualized this is that by pooling the studies into the meta-analysis, we are sort of vastly aided in terms of statistical power. And I think that what you should think about, at least for the purpose of this talk, is the design of sort of the meta study, sort of that incorporates the estimates from all 6 studies. So I want to our 4 main hypotheses that we test in this is first, the obvious, right? We think that monitoring should reduce resource use. And here we're going to mean some form of extraction, like deforestation, or also degradation. We can think about measures of water quality or pollutant concentration. And so these are going to be all measured using physical or chemical measures of the common pool resource. Our other three hypotheses focus more on governance or community sort of beliefs, perceptions, and behaviors. And so our hypotheses 2 to 4 are that monitoring should increase user or citizen satisfaction with the resource. Monitoring should increase user knowledge of the resource. And finally, monitoring should increase user stewardship of the common pool resource. And here we mean sort of behaviors in terms of like both norms and sort of behaviors in terms of participation in meetings in terms of the common pool resource. We'll talk a little bit in more detail. And so these H2 through H4 are all going to be measured using questions on user and line surveys. This metacata in particular, I think all of them face this problem, but this one, sort of the problem of how do you measure outcomes across very different contexts, is probably the most severe. And you can think about this sort of very straightforward, in a very straightforward way. We're looking at different resource systems. And that means that, you know, when we make comparisons of these resource units, we're comparing totally different units, so to speak. And so there's questions that emerge like, how do we compare kilowatt hours of energy consumption to sort of the hectares deforested in a community? And then I think this sort of thinking along these lines leads us to a broader sort of question. So when we think about doing harmonized surveys in different contexts, should survey questions be harmonized on construct? So sort of the broad latent concept we're trying to get at, or the like actual wording of the question, right? Should we be trying to ask the same question up to issues of translation? I see one question maybe. Users are going to be community members in the context of this. I know that in some of the resource systems, particularly in China, we are concerned with people from the outside, sort of not users, sort of resource predators, so to speak, from the outside. But we're thinking about users in terms of the people within the communities that contain and in principle need to manage the resource. So our approach to this measurement question is to use a z-score index for all outcomes. So all of our outcomes can be interpreted in terms of standard deviation units, in terms of control, the control group standard deviation. And what we've adopted to do is to try to do sort of the same thing across both our resource outcomes and our survey outcomes. And what we're going to be doing is harmonizing on the construct and then going from there and trying to get the best site-specific measure. And so what I mean by this in the survey context is each of the survey-based outcomes is going to incorporate measures of several different constructs. For example, satisfaction measure examines user satisfaction or community member satisfaction with the resource status, sort of like, you know, are you satisfied with the forest? Other users' behavior, and then the management of the resource. And so we sort of took those broad concepts and we asked for the best site-specific operationalization. And this sort of follows from our approach to the resource outcomes themselves. All right. I'm going to report to you today the estimates from a meta-analysis. We're going to use a random effects meta-analysis estimator. And what this means is that we're going to assume that the ITTs, the intent to treat effects, are drawn from some common distribution that's distributed normally. And sort of we have two quantities of interest. Sort of our main estimator is sort of what the mean of that distribution is for mu. And so we're going to be sort of pool our site-specific estimates and then estimate mu. And then if you think about sort of a normal distribution, right, we also care about the variance, which here is going to be the between site variance. And the way that we're going to incorporate this into what we're recording is we're going to sort of present a 95% predictive interval that incorporates obviously the mean, but also the between site variance. I won't speak very much about it, but we also had some sort of estimators that try to look at between community as opposed to between site heterogeneity. So I'll just sort of describe those, some of those findings in words. So I want to think about first, in terms of our results, about our first question, right, which is just, can we get communities to adopt these monitoring practices when they're initiated from the outside? And so here we have a plot of monitoring uptake. And so we basically collapsed our data to the quarter of the intervention. So this went over the course of a year. So each of these represents 3 months. And we look at the proportion of communities that submitted for which we have evidence in form of reports or monitoring output of monitoring over the course of the year. And so on the x-axis, we have the sort of quarter, and on the y-axis, we just have descriptively the proportion of communities engaged in monitoring these programs. And what we see is we see 5 sites in which we have quite high levels of uptake and generally high persistence over the course of the year. And so in Costa Rica, Peru, China, Liberia, and Uganda, we had sort of the vast majority of communities were actively engaged in monitoring throughout the course of the year. In Brazil, however, we see sort of substantially lower rates, even in the first quarter, when sort of less than about a third of communities were engaged, in the treatment group were engaged in monitoring, and then that fell off over the course of the year. So it's obviously it's somewhat difficult to understand sort of what the precise cause of sort of these different levels of compliance with monitoring or uptake of monitoring in the different sites. In Brazil, sort of qualitatively, we sort of suspect 3 possible things that happened. First, there were technological challenges. So the team did an amazing job developing a low-cost well water measurement device. These are usually quite expensive. But sort of once they got to the field, there were a lot of wells in which the cover could not be taken off. And so the actual device was not as useful in those communities. Second, this was a team that worked sort of without an NGO partner, which may have made it harder to stay in contact and sort of have a presence in communities. We're not sure. And finally, these were the sites in which the government of Brazil, when they create a well, appoints sort of a person as sort of a well overseer, so to speak, which is in some sense close to a monitor. And sort of we can't fully distinguish between those 3 explanations, but we sort of suspect that that's responsible for some of the differences. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate our full meta-analysis as pre-specified, both with the Brazilian data, and then estimate a separate version without the Brazilian data, just given that it's not clear that monitoring actually occurred in Brazil, or occurred at a high level in Brazil. So our first hypothesis looks at resource use or extraction or degradation. And so we hypothesized that monitoring would lead to lower resource use. And what you can see, and I'll present sort of a standard set of plots in these, is we can see in the upper panel, we have the intent to treat effect across the sites. And we can see that these effects are quite noisy, but in general sort of suggest reductions in resource use, just looking at the point estimates. And so what we find then is when we look at sort of the mean of the distribution of effects, right, we find a reduction in resource use of 0.096 or 0.092 standard deviation units with and without Brazil, respectively, in the second panel. In the final panel, we're presenting our 95% predictive intervals, which incorporate sort of between site variance. And so we find sort of suggestive evidence of highly suggestive evidence of sort of a modest decrease in resource use in these communities. And one thing that's important to note here is that resource reductions are concentrated in communities with sort of the most severe extraction. And we can see this in 2 ways. So we have pre-specified heterogeneous treatment effects that look in communities sort of above and below the median of predicted sort of resource extraction. And we find this entire effect driven by those sort of with high levels of predicted resource extraction. We can also do sort of a meta-analysis of quantile treatment effects, which suggests that lots of these reductions are driven by the most severely impacted communities. All right. Our second measure looks at user satisfaction, and we hypothesized that users would be sort of an increase in user satisfaction or community member satisfaction. And so what we see in the top panel is sort of the study estimates in terms of the intent to treat effects. We see our estimates of mu in the second panel, which suggest increases in user satisfaction. We find sort of a 0.051 standard deviation, standardized effect size with Brazil, and sort of a larger 0.085 increase in user satisfaction without Brazil. And sort of these sort of estimates are reflected also when we look at the 95% predictive interval. I think one thing that's important to notice here is with the first result on resource use, it seems that users trade off are trading off more short-term use, right? So we see low reductions in resource extraction, and yet they also remain more satisfied with the governance of the resource or the use and governance of the resource. These increases when we look at sort of the component constructs of our index are driven by satisfaction with resource management and the resource itself, not with other citizens or users' behavior. In terms of user knowledge, you can see in the sort of top panel, we see increases in user knowledge in many of the sites, still relatively noisy estimates. When we pull these studies, we estimate about a 0.08 increase standardized effect size on user knowledge. And so we look sort of across 7 different components of this index, and we find small positive effects consistent with sort of our index on all of the components of the index with very little variation across sites. In some sense, this may be the most easy or immediate of our outcomes to move, right? We can think about the community workshops that happened at the beginning of this process, potentially imparting information about CPR management and the resource that could move knowledge independent of the effects of monitoring. Okay? But we obviously can't decompose where this knowledge comes from. Finally, we hypothesized that user stewardship would improve. And we actually don't find effects of this. So we can look at, in 4 of the sites, we found effects very, very close to 0. Then we found sort of a substantial increase in Liberia and a substantial decrease in Peru, right? And so when we pool these, we're estimating basically no effect on user stewardship. And so this means norms and then participation in sort of community meetings relating to the resource or some type of collective action. Our predictive intervals are truncated just so you can see the main estimates in the bottom panel. But we have sort of, very sort of drastically heterogeneous effects, at least within 2 of the sites. And one thing we find when we look at sort of just the raw data is we find very strong norms across sites and very high willingness to pay for conservation control in all sites. And so in some sense, it's interesting that at least within the control group, Liberia and Peru are sort of the highest in terms of the norms, and these are where we see the movement. So in some sense, in Liberia, we're mobilizing sort of the least likely people to sort of support or pay for patrols. And then in Peru, we see some sort of drop off. We sort of attribute this in the paper to sort of reattribution of authority for monitoring and sort of less willingness of citizens to participate because they know that monitors are already doing this. Okay, so I want to think about why we see the effects we do and what this means for the policy implications in terms of thinking about monitoring as a policy intervention. So first, we can think about how does the provision of information change resource use? And sort of drawing upon existing literature, we have sort of some 3 possible ideas about why this might happen. Right, it may be that information facilitates more efficient enforcement, where we know where violations have happened. It's sort of easier to sort of enforce against sort of overuse or extraction. Information may sort of alert users to sort of the severity of the problem or the salience of the problem, increasing demand for enforcement in some way. Also, information, just learning about what the situation is, may mobilize communities to create new rules or institutions regarding resource resource use. And these things should then ultimately shape resource use. And so in some sense, what we find is sort of a little less clean than what you may sort of desire on this. So we see sort of, at least anecdotally, evidence of very different mechanisms in play in different places. And so the sort of first place to think about this is like, we can think about the forest versus the water studies. And so when we think about who has the authority to manage the resource, in the forest studies, the community always plays a role. Sometimes this is overlapping with sort of national forest entities or sort of environmental prosecutors, the national government. But at least in these three sites, the communities retain at least some de facto control over their forests. In contrast, in China and Costa Rica, at least, the sort of main authority for resource management is outside the community. In China, it's within some local bureaucracy. In Costa Rica, it's like an elected water board or community water board, right? Yeah, water management board organization. And so in some sense, we see greater scope for community changes in the rules, sort of this ladder mechanism and possibly demand for enforcement in the forest study sites, just given sort of that the users are in principle members of this management authority in some way, shape, or form, right? And so one of our intermediate outcomes we looked at is we looked at sort of scrutiny on resource management authorities, both in Liberia, and we see sort of positive impacts in scrutiny, but this is driven by Liberia and Peru, which you'll recall had sort of the biggest changes in this sort of stewardship behaviors or norms. And so one thing that sort of the authors of these papers suggest are sort of idiosyncratic or different organizational changes in how communities are sort of responding to resource threats or governing CPRs in these sites, whether it means in sort of delegating to monitors as sort of like a bureaucratic entity almost, or in Liberia, sort of reducing inequalities and sort of knowledge and participation in resource governance. And this also has some suggestive evidence of increased demand or new rules in these sites. In contrast, in China and Costa Rica, sort of the interventions themselves focused heavily on dissemination of evidence to external management bodies. And so here, the China study is particularly informative because they randomized whether information was going to citizens, so the residents of these micro neighborhoods, or the government bureaucracy that manages water. And so one thing that we can do is we can do a meta-analysis instead of with the sort of common treatment arm, alternate treatment arm in China, and this sort of decomposes those effects. And one thing that we look at, so on the left, I'm just repeating the same figure about dissemination to citizens, where we have sort of like a 0.08, 0.09 standardized effect reduction in resource use. When we look at with China with this alternate treatment arm, we see a much bigger effect on resource use when information is needed to governments as opposed to citizens, which you can see on here. The point estimate from China changes. And when we pull this into the meta-analysis, we estimate sort of a much larger, nearly 0.2 standardized effect reduction on resource use across sites, which to us is sort of suggests that we have at least anecdotal evidence across the sites for evidence of these three mechanisms. So in the forest studies, so in China, potentially higher efficiency of enforcement or incentives to enforce among those with that authority, and then sort of changes in potential demand or community organization in some of the forest sites. But we have sort of different mechanisms present across the different sites from what we can gather anecdotally from the data. Yet this yields sort of similar sized reductions in resource use, at least according to our estimates of the heterogeneity and intent to treat effect across sites. And so in some sense, this speaks to like the robustness of monitoring as an intervention, right? Working in very heterogeneous contexts with heterogeneous underlying institutions and sort of organizations. It seems that we're able to enact sort of reductions on average across sites by implementing new community monitoring programs. I think that there's two further sort of contributions or insights with respect to sort of the common core resource literature that are worth talking about here. And so when we think about the common core resource literature in its entirety, this literature identifies a ton, certainly more than 100 things that are alternately called institutions, design features, design principles, infrastructures that matter for common core resource governance outcomes. Right, and so what we're trying to do here is we're trying to manipulate one of those in isolation. So in some sense, this helps us with sort of both the endogenous adoption point, obviously, but also with thinking about the issue of clustering of design features across places. By manipulating a single one of these institutions monitoring, we can look at the effects of that, at least as a new policy. And I think that this is sort of a promising direction to the extent that we're studying many of these 100 policies are not sort of manipulable from a policy perspective. We've chosen obviously one that is. And so one of the issues is that many design features can't be practically or ethically manipulated, right? No one is proposing that, we have all these sort of guidance for optimal population size in these communities. No one is advocating some sort of forced displacement to get the optimal sized community, right? So we're in some sense already reduced to a much smaller number of policy levers that we could try to use to promote sustainable resource governance in communities. And so here I think that monitoring is informative particularly because it is one of a limited number of sort of manipulable institutions or design features. I think when we sort of step back from this, back into this sort of really complex world with like lots of different things that could determine the resource use or the sustainability of resource management, we should think that sort of the creation of community monitoring from the outside is yielding sort of modest but robust reductions in common core resource use or degradation across contexts. So we should sort of note that this pertains to a population of sites that's quite different, but that a common prior, that there is a common prior that information could alleviate common core resource management problems, right? Yet, sort of given sort of the distribution of interest in this project, we do think that this is sort of quite a broad set of places. And then what we've done is we've sort of used parallel experiments to manipulate sort of one design feature in these very different contexts. Further research in terms of thinking about how do we sort of get, promote sort of bigger effects is it may be necessary to bundle multiple levers or sort of design features in communities to achieve greater gains. So our approach here was to monitoring is obviously a somewhat bundled treatment, but try to reduce the scope of what's being varied. One could try to sort of go in with the kitchen sink and see if that yields sort of bigger differences. Or an alternate thing would be to think about what other policies look like and evaluate different levers, right, different institutions or design features across contexts in this way. And so thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your comments.
Great, thank you so much, Tara. Okay, so we're at about 11:48 now, so we've got time for some Q&A. So if you'd like to use the raise hand function in the participants list, that would be maybe the easiest way to go about it. And then we can just basically take questions or interventions as they come in. So that's great. Amanda, why don't you get us started?
Hi, Tara. Thanks so much for the presentation. I had kind of one basic question and then one more substantive question. And you kind of touched a little bit on the first one, but I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about the community selection criteria. I'm just kind of having a hard time understanding why the different communities were selected and how, of course, that's impacting the interventions. And then the second question I have is thinking about whether or not there was any context monitoring that was also done in these community selection sites. And I asked that because you kind of start the presentation by thinking about how monitoring and community monitoring in particular can be used as a form of crisis prevention. So my question is, was there context monitoring, and did you see anything, even if anecdotally, of connecting community monitoring to crisis prevention or crisis management?
Great. So on the first question, there were sort of two steps in the selection process in all sites. The first was sort of the selection of sites for the metadata itself, right? So these 6 different sites, and then within the sites, we sought to look for communities sort of on 2 dimensions. First, communities that have common pool resources, right, to manage, right? That was the criteria, and also those in certain sites, it was selected based. There were site-specific selection criteria based on sort of whether communities would allow monitors in various forms and whether it would be safe for the NGO to operate. And so those criteria are a little bit more idiosyncratic across sites. Right, for example, in the Peruvian site, there are communities that are involved in coca growing for which it is not safe for any sort of NGO official or enumerator to come into the community. And so those were sort of eliminated. And so this sort of yields a sort of slightly different sort of population in different places. But I think sort of the core thing that unites these places are that they are communities with common pool resources that sort of have not been doing monitoring regularly. On the second point, can you elaborate what you mean by context monitoring?
Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of if one of the assumptions built into community monitoring of natural resources or of community pool resources is that there is now a mechanism for community members to manage and navigate conflicts. I was curious to whether the context, the broader context in terms of monitoring whether or not any of these disputes happened were mitigated by the community monitoring. Does that help?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is anecdotal and sort of it's not something that we've measured sort of systematically across sites. I can speak in the case of Peru, in which is sort of the conflict occurs between people outside the community and people inside, potentially people inside and people collaborating with people outside. And sort of we did a number of interviews with the community chiefs who suggested that like learning about where this was happening was fundamental in the way that they address these threats with outsiders. I don't know if, I don't want to put Cyrus on the spot, but if there was anything in Liberia that speaks to that question, I don't know.
Well, I think in Liberia, the situation was a little bit different and actually is connected to a question that I want to ask, sort of in part responds to your question, but actually poses another one, if I may. I'm just wondering, having looked at the results across the different studies, have you come to a more refined understanding of the conditions like that in which like common pool dilemma as like an analytical framework is the right way for thinking about the natural resource management problems that we're looking at in these different settings? I mean, was it clear to you ex post now that in fact is the right framework in all of these cases, or was there heterogeneity? Because I think the reason I raise that is because in the Liberia case, it's, you know, upon doing more intensive descriptive analysis of the context, it struck us that horizontal conflict between households was probably not the most relevant factor in determining resource use patterns, and also in determining, you know, issues that contribute to the vulnerability of households with respect to like unsustainable resource use. So degradation could undermine household interests, but it wasn't the story of like common pool dilemmas leading to overuse of the commons and everybody kind of sort of like inflicting harm on themselves, but rather it was households being sort of sidelined in deals that would then accrue to the benefit of elites, and so household interests were sidelined, and so they suffered the externalities without really realizing any of the benefits. And so it was the issues that seem more relevant were like vertical accountability type issues, households having a say, and then being aware of what was going on. And I'm just wondering, so then like for us afterward, we were sort of wondering, okay, so the common pool dilemma framework is sort of the dominant framework that gets used in these sort of local resource management contexts and motivate studies and things like that. But it wasn't clear to us that it's the only one or necessarily the most relevant one in a lot of contexts. And in particular in forest edge communities in Liberia, it wasn't clear that it was the most relevant dynamic at work.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know that. So I think that you're right that sort of common pool resource problems are generally sort of presented as sort of horizontal conflict or horizontal sort of differences in interest, so to speak. I don't know that that sort of is fundamental to the definition of what a common pool resource is, right? And so I think that you're right that we should be thinking about sort of different forms of community dynamics. I think sort of at least one thing that was interesting is it seems that in Liberia, sort of these issues, you're right that these issues had sort of not incorporated large segments of the population. Liberia had sort of the lowest rate of citizens like in control, either going to meetings or expressing sort of interest in some way in the resource, and that sort of shot up in the treatment group. Whereas that was not necessarily the case in other places, right? In Peru, we had large majorities of people, even in control, who argued that they went to community meetings about forest governance. And so I think sort of the underlying framework or the underlying sort of interactions that we're dealing with vary across the sites. I think that thinking about these resources systems as common pool resources is perhaps useful just for organizing sort of what we're looking at, but I think looking at different mechanisms suggests that sort of very different strategic dynamics are potentially happening.
Great. I see Morgan's got a hand up.
Allison has something in the chat.
Oh, okay. Allison, would you like to read the question out and then we'll go to Morgan next?
Sorry, Morgan.
Sure, I hope my microphone is working. I just was curious that many of the outcomes, and thanks Morgan, many of the outcomes were focused on users and the community users, citizens. And I was just curious, I think you said in Costa Rica and Brazil, there were actually either government or some other sort of resource management body formally established. So I was just curious, I mean, I guess in focusing so much on users, where there is that kind of a body, is it then putting too much expectation or responsibility on citizens themselves to change some of these outcomes? So I was just curious if there was any other evidence or exploration of those types of relationships between the community users studied and other external resource management bodies. And maybe they don't exist, and so that was why not.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that our strongest evidence here is on sort of the China side of things, right? Where we looked at basically and so in that side, it's interesting because we don't actually know the origin of contamination, right? It's maybe industrial and it may be sort of low-level individual citizens, right? And so the composition of that is really going to determine sort of what it seems that citizens can do, at least within their own micro-neighborhood. I'll speak louder, sorry, Jacqueline. What users can do sort of within their own local community. And so to the extent that we find sort of the effect on resource use in China driven largely by sharing the information with government, that suggests that sort of in this context, perhaps sort of it's not something that is within the scope of users to sort of regulate. And so that's the strongest evidence. In Costa Rica, sort of we have the community water management organizations are in principle elected, and so there may be somewhat closer links between them and the communities, but it's sort of quite divorced in China from what I understand, sort of reading the project as a whole. And so I think that that's where we have the strongest evidence in terms of this relationship between community users and government. In Costa Rica, they're able to track sort of the responsiveness by government, by these community water management organizations over time, and identify some barriers in that relationship. Morgan?
Tara, thank you so much for presenting this to all of us. We really appreciate taking the time. My question was almost exactly the same as Allison's, just wondering, besides China, where they clearly did look at that, if other government bodies had regulatory control, just because I know there's some interesting evidence from the anti-corruption literature on when NGOs work with government oversight bodies, it can be more effective. So I think you already answered the question that there wasn't that much, that didn't exist in many of the countries. So we weren't able to look at it, but just, yeah, wondering also about that sort of dynamic.
Yeah, so I think that in the forest studies, there's a variation. There are sort of overlapping authorities, right? So I mean, in Peru, you have environmental prosecutors who in principle are the ones that are supposed to be enforcing against the individuals and groups responsible for deforestation. So in this case, I think there was some communities sort of first level of recourse was within the community, but when things were really bad or when they couldn't deal with it, they took sort of evidence from the monitoring to the environmental prosecutors. And so I think that there is some forms of sort of overlapping jurisdiction in some of these. We don't have sort of the experimental leverage to sort of suss that out entirely, but it's sort of an important dynamic to think about whether government bodies, even in places where communities have de facto authority, can sort of strengthen strengthen any sort of response to this information. I think that that's an important point for future work.
Thank you.
We've got Daniel.
Hey, Tara. I have to say, that I'm really impressed with the with the work that's gone into this project and the analysis that's been done. And part of it is sort of how you frame the meta-analysis paper. I'm guessing that this presentation was kind of the skeleton for that paper. And so, I encourage you as you go forward with this to highlight, just how surprising these results might be, right? In the sense that, you had such heterogeneity across settings and such heterogeneity across the kinds of resources studied, and the substance of the interventions were quite different from site to site. And yet, you still, the pooled analysis shows, detectable effects. And I'm not sure that, that unbiased observers would have anticipated this, right? So, and so I think that's pretty impressive and worth highlighting. I just, part of my comment here is based on having reread Georgia Fosu's and Dan Posner's pre-analysis plan stock taking, which looks at EGAP pre-analysis plans in addition to PAPS in economics. So I would just encourage you as you go forward, and maybe I'm sure this is planned, but to make a clear delineation between what was pre-registered and what's exploratory. So I'm sure this will be part of the paper, but I encourage you to make it front and center, in part because the pre-analysis plan, as I have read it and was involved in producing it, really tried to think through a lot of the challenges and possibilities that would be coming. For example, I think given the pre-analysis plan, the decision to estimate with and without Brazil was actually anticipated in the pre-analysis plan, right? So, if for logistical reasons, the intervention could not be done, you had a plan for exclusion, and so I think that is laudable and worth highlighting. But as far as I can tell, or as far as I remember, the meta-analysis with the alternative China arm, wasn't anticipated, or maybe it arguably was, and and I missed that. But But I think that, there was kind of unusually a meta-analysis plan submitted for the, or a pre-analysis plan submitted for the meta-analysis. So a meta pre-analysis plan. That is not usually done. And of course it's the standard in Medicaid. But a lot of the analysis that was performed that you presented here was exactly as anticipated. And so that's, I think, worth highlighting as you go forward with the paper.
Thank you so much. So I think you're absolutely right. We elicited the researchers' priors or members of the team's priors in 2019 before APSA in DC, which would have been sort of after the projects had come out of the field, but before anybody had seen data from other sites. And I think that the results were surprising to the members of the team. We don't have that in the main analysis. And then I think to the other point, you're absolutely right. I don't recall that we had specific exclusion criteria for sites in the pre-analysis plan, we did talk about sort of compliance with monitoring in the pre-analysis plan. You're absolutely right. And so I think the sort of exclusion of Brazil is like a little bit of gray area. The two exploratory things that I mentioned here were the quantile treatment effects, which is sort of just another check on this idea that resource use decreased more in communities that face higher threats. And then you're correct about China. So China was an interesting thing. When we did an original pre-analysis plan when these things went to the field, and then one before we saw any of the end-line data. And there was a lot of consternation with the China team about which treatment arm should be the common one. And so they ultimately changed what they specified the common arm to be between that original and the latter one. And so, yes, that's sort of outside the scope of sort of our pre-analysis plan, but there was a few moving parts on that in between those two pre-analysis plans. But yeah, the point is well taken, and we've documented all of our deviations in our SI. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, we're just past noon. I think that we've gotten to all the interventions that people have. Does anybody else have a question? If so, raise your hand now. Okay, it doesn't look like it. Okay, great, terrific. So Tara, that was fabulous. I hope the feedback was useful too. Thanks everybody for joining. And be on the lookout for future events that we have. And also, if you have work that you would like to present or have discussed in an online format like this, just reach out. Max is sending out emails regularly soliciting those sorts of things. So we're happy to organize that. So thank you again, Tara. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.